happy Earth Day. Today is the 50th anniversary. I'm Elizabeth Henry, president of the Environmental League of Massachusetts. ELM is a 121-year-old environmental advocacy organization based on Beacon Hill. We've been advocating for Massachusetts to lead the nation in responsible environmental policy since 1898. We've long been a convener on environmental issues, and we are proud to continue this long tradition in a new digital way. I'm delighted to welcome our over 500 registrants joining us by Zoom and those of you who are watching this on Facebook Live. You include policymakers, business people, environmental advocates, social justice leaders, parents, grandparents, teachers, and students. And we're also pleased to have so many employees of our ELM Corporate Council member companies joining us today. Personally, I hope that you and your families are safe and that you're finding ways to get outside and connect with each other and with nature during this unprecedented time. I'd like to welcome you to this third edition of ELM's new weekly webinar series, the third of 10 sessions, which will run through June 10th. We've endeavored to make these sessions timely, thought-provoking, and forward-thinking. If there are topics that you'd like us to cover in a future webinar, please suggest them in that Q&A box below. And I want to especially extend my thanks to Biogen, whose generous support makes this series possible. In the past 2 weeks, we've heard about the profound interconnections between climate change and human health, how the most vulnerable among us are bearing the brunt of those impacts. And we've seen how public policy plays the central role in determining how we manage the two crises of COVID-19 and climate change. So today it's fitting that we dive deep into public policy, exploring ways to ensure that our COVID-19 recovery can accelerate progress in the fights against climate change and inequality. Next Wednesday, we'll hear from Pulitzer Prize-winning Boston Globe environmental reporter David Abel, and he'll reflect on the evolution of climate journalism, on how human impacts of climate change create compelling stories, and the ways in which COVID-19 is shaping today's climate coverage. So for the next hour, you can expect about 15 minutes of remarks from Senator Markey, 15 minutes of discussions with questions from the ELM team and those that were submitted in advance from registrants like you, and then 20 minutes of live Q&A from you, the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, please click below on that Q&A button to submit a question anytime throughout the webinar. Or if you see one that resonates with you, you can vote it up so that it's more likely to be asked. We got a lot of questions in advance, and I'm expecting a lot of questions throughout, so we will consolidate the topics and Senator Markey and I can respond. As I mentioned, this event is being broadcast on Facebook Live, and we're also recording these sessions. They'll be available on ELM's YouTube page, so you can share it beyond those that were able to attend. A brief disclaimer, this forum is designed to educate the public and to discuss current policy issues, and it's being hosted by a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So for legal reasons, we unfortunately can't address any questions related to this fall's election or to campaigns. That said, all of your questions, both answered and unanswered, will be shared with Markey's Senate office after the webinar. So there will be opportunities for your conversations and questions to continue with his team if they can't be addressed today. So we are so privileged to have Senator Ed Markey with us. Senator Markey is a national leader on energy and the environment. He's a member of the Environment and Public Works Committee, the Committee on Science and Commerce, Science and Transportation, the Foreign Relations Committee, and he's also chair of the Senate Climate Task Force. Among his notable achievements, Senator Markey partnered with Henry Waxman to write the landmark Waxman-Markey bill. This was the only comprehensive climate legislation ever to pass a Chamber of Commerce, and it gave hope to the world that the United States was serious about addressing climate change. It helped President Obama effectively negotiate with the international community. In his time in Congress, he's authored laws that increased fuel economy standards, stopped the construction of hundreds of coal-fired power plants, established the Northeast Home Heating Oil Reserve, and opened up wholesale electric power markets for the first time. Recently, Senator Markey introduced legislation that would spur the growth of the offshore wind industry in the US by extending tax credits. And of course, we all know Senator Markey as the co-author of the Green New Deal with Representative Ocasio-Cortez. Senator Markey has 40 years of legislative experience representing Massachusetts in the US House and now in the Senate. He also served 2 terms in the Massachusetts State House, where he represented Melrose and his hometown of Malden. So as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day and consider how an economic recovery could be clean, green, and equitable, it is a privilege to welcome Senator Markey to the line. Senator.
Thank you, Elizabeth, so much. Thank you for your great leadership. Thank you for the Environmental League of Massachusetts and all you do to make Massachusetts the very special place to live and to know that we have the highest environmental standards, but at the same time that there is so much more for us to do. And I want to thank everybody who is participating today. This is Earth Day. This is a great celebration for us. We've come a long way in the last 50 years in terms of the environmental laws which are on the books. The Superfund program, the laws which have transformed our relationship with wind and solar, the all-electric vehicle revolution, all of it was not remotely possible when we began this journey on Earth Day 50 years ago. So now our opportunity is to build on it. The coronavirus epidemic is clearly right now shining a light on what happens when you ignore science, when you ignore the warnings, when you ignore all of the telltale signs of a problem developing scientifically, but with leadership that has decided to deny that it's a threat, to defund the very programs that you would need in order to deal with it. So when I look back in January, with the Trump budget was cutting the public health service by 40%, cutting the NIH by 10%, cutting the CDC by 20%. That's as the coronavirus was already building in China, and we had a need for us to act. Well, the same thing is now true. We already have the warnings. We can already see what is coming our way with regard to climate and its threats, and we have to do something about it. So that's why, as Elizabeth said, I introduced the Green New Deal just a little more than a year ago. And the Green New Deal has actually transformed the way in which people relate to this issue, how they see this issue. We have a tremendous opportunity to capture the momentum of the interest, especially amongst young people who are joining preceding generations of activists on climate to build a movement which has incredible political power. So what we did with the Green New Deal was to identify basically the three component parts. Number one, that the planet is dangerously warming, that there are no emergency rooms for planets, and we have to ensure that we put in place all of the preventative programs that can deal with it. And so that includes wind and solar, storage, battery technologies, all electric vehicle incentives, agricultural policies that have to change so that they become much more sustainable, that we insulate all of our public buildings and other buildings in our society just to dramatically reduce the greenhouse gases which we are emitting, and to simultaneously create millions of new jobs, green energy jobs in our society, the largest single job creation engine for blue-collar jobs in generations in America, and to do so in a way which includes everyone, which is the third part, so that it deals with frontline communities. It deals with intersectionality. It says that minorities that had historically been excluded would be fully included in the Green New Deal. Because we know that Black and brown families have historically breathed different air than those who lived in the suburbs. And we know that. And in a lot of ways, coronavirus is once again exposing this reality of the different lives that people in Chelsea and Lawrence and Brockton live. And it is absolutely imperative as a result that we put in place the protections, we put in place the guarantees that they are not going to be impacted. So from my perspective, we have a great opportunity going forward because we will want to have a recovery. We will want to put in place programs that guarantee that we are in fact, on a road to recovery. And that's the beauty of the green energy revolution. It is perfectly positioned to ensure that we capture this economic opportunity. We did the same thing back in 07 and 08. After the Great Recession, we saw an opportunity in 2009 to pass legislation that spurred tremendous growth in wind and solar and battery technologies, and created hundreds of thousands of new jobs. And that was a way out of the Great Recession. Well, the same thing is true right now. We have the same great green opportunity to take this incredible catastrophe, which has hit our country, and out of it, if the president wants to talk about an infrastructure bill, well, we do too, but we want to talk about it as a green infrastructure bill. We want to talk about it as something that doesn't just say, oh, to the oil and gas industry, we want to take care of you, but we want to say, no, the way out are the jobs of the future. That is the way in which we're going to create opportunities for young people in our country, not just for jobs, but for careers in this clean energy sector. So we have to get up, we have to fight, we have to stand for what we believe in, but the opportunities are there. We have an incredible chance to save all of creation by engaging in massive job creation, and we have to make our case and make it powerfully and without compromise as we move into this whole debate about an infrastructure bill and the way out of this deep recession, perhaps depression, into which our economy has been sinking. So, Elizabeth, thank you so much for inviting me on, and I look forward to being able to answer any questions that people might have.
All right, thank you so much, Senator. It really means a lot to have you here on this 50th anniversary of Earth Day. I can imagine this is a really busy day for you. Luckily, we have a torrent of great questions. And so many of the listeners asked to be sort of brought into the thinking of Washington. And so I'm going to start with a question about current events. Yesterday, you and your Senate colleagues passed another $480 billion relief bill, including a major expansion of the small business loan program. And there's talk of more emergency funds and stimulus after that. Can you just share with us how the stimulus is taking shape and what role you think infrastructure investment is going to be taking?
Yeah, well, we're just beginning to discuss what will be in the next big package. It'll be much bigger than the package which is passing this week. And so that's why this conversation, this webinar is so timely, because this is the time for us to begin the process of making it quite clear what we do want to be in the stimulus bill and what we don't want to be in there. For sure, we don't want huge bailouts for the oil and gas industry, because right now they're on the phone to Trump in the Oval Office, to Mnuchin, working hard to make sure that they get a huge percentage of any new bill which we pass. Our job, and I think our time has arrived, is to now make the case for massive investment in wind and solar and all of the other technologies, energy conservation strategies, and that we have to be in and aggressive in doing it right now, which is what I'm doing, to make sure that we lay down our marker in terms of not bailing out the oil and gas industries, while simultaneously making the case for what will create a whole new generation of jobs for people in our country.
So, Senator, you have been a lawmaker both at the state level here in Massachusetts and at the federal level. And a listener asked, what are the three most important actions that Congress can take to jumpstart a clean, green economy? And what are the three actions that we should be taking at the state level?
Well, I think we need to be very cognizant of the fact that at the top of the list has to be an organized effort to block the oil and gas companies, the coal companies, from coming in with their hands out saying that they want a huge percentage of this next bill. Number two, I think we have to work very, very hard to make sure that we're still on the front lines, and that's what ELM does on an ongoing basis to fight back against the Trump administration's watering down of existing environmental laws, mercury, fuel economy standards, you name it. They're using this coronavirus crisis as a way to just instruct EPA and instruct the other agencies to just move as quickly as they can to roll back already existing protections. And then I think we get a chance as well to put in place kind of the job training, the opportunities for young people to be able to get the training they need for these jobs of the future in the clean energy sector. I was over at Roxbury Community College just last year, and they now have a new program over there, a new major over there in sustainable energy to learn how to install wind or solar or energy efficiency technologies in our society. So I think that's how we have to think, that this gives us an opportunity to lay out a pathway for job creation for the future in the clean energy sector, while simultaneously blocking the old view of the world, which is going to be coming in here with a vengeance, looking to take the lion's share of what we're going to be talking about. And we have an effort to beat them. We have a real opportunity to do so. I would just say, though, that our energy levels have to go higher than they've ever been before, because we have a real opportunity to do some real good in this next round of the infrastructure bill, the stimulus bill that we're going to be debating.
Senator, you were also in Congress during the Great Recession in 2008. What lessons are you taking from how we recovered from that slowdown as you think about recovering from COVID?
Yeah, well, what we said to ourselves back then was, this is our opportunity to put into legislation the incentives to really begin to telescope the time frame that it takes to get to a point where these clean energy technologies are looked upon as a part of our society, as part of the fabric. So when you go back to 2008, there was only 2,000 megawatts of wind in America. There were only 2,000 megawatts of solar in America. Well, we now have more than 100,000 megawatts of wind. We had more than 10,000 new megawatts of solar installed just alone in 2019. Now, a lot of that happened because of that stimulus bill in 2009. We built in $90 billion worth of incentives for all of those renewable technologies, for energy conservation, for the kind of basic research that would have to be done so that we can make real progress. And when you check in 10 years later, you can see the dividends of that investment. You can see that all of the experts who said that, well, yeah, renewables are interesting, but they'll never be a big part of our electricity structure, or all electric vehicles are a good idea, but they'll never really be embraced in our country. Well, it just turns out that they were totally wrong, that a higher and higher and higher and higher percentage of all new electrical generation every single year now is in the renewable sector. There were only 2,000 total all electric vehicles in the country in 2008. We now have 1.4 million all electric vehicles. If we had put the incentives on the books a lot earlier, we would have had those all electric vehicles a lot earlier. It's not as though it's a technological problem, it's really a political problem. And we were able to solve that in 2009 because of the Great Recession in that huge package which we passed. Well, I think we have to view this the same way, that this is going to be a big opportunity for us if we're well organized to build in the incentives for each one of those technologies, which we know are going to be massive job creators in our country.
I've been interested to see how Europe is already starting to incorporate climate policy into their recovery, and in some countries they're even using the framework of a Green New Deal or a Green Deal. How is what's happening in other countries influencing Congress? Is this motivating Congress to step up their game?
Well, I think at this point, Congress really hasn't focused upon other countries because we're so focused on coronavirus and how it's impacting us. But I do think that those examples are going to be illustrative of how our economic partners and rivals are viewing the way in which they can come out of this recession much more quickly. And I think that we can use them as examples so that we don't fall behind, that we don't lose this incredible opportunity which is being presented to us to be the leader and not the laggard in energy technologies. So my hope would be that the world realizes that science is speaking to us, that the climate crisis is real in the same way that the coronavirus threat was real, and that it makes no sense for us to repeat history and to ignore the warnings. And economically, I think that we should learn the lessons of what other countries are doing in their recovery and incorporate it and do even better in our own recovery bill.
You know, you talked about fossil fuels. I think many of us on the line have been watching just the spectacular fall in oil prices. The price of oil went to zero for the first time last week. Oil futures were actually in the negatives. What impact do we think these record low oil prices are going to have on this transition to renewables?
Well, the price of oil went down dramatically during the Great Recession of 08 and 09. We took that as our opportunity to, again, invest in the clean energy technologies. And then as each year went by, our technologies just kept doing better and better and better and better. So build upon that momentum, but make no mistake about it, they're going to be meeting in the White House on a regular basis with the oil company executives. They're going to be trying their best to receive the kind of bailouts that they're always insulting us by saying that's what we're looking for. When we introduced the Green New Deal, Trump and Fox News just kept calling it socialism. You know, look at what they're looking for, a handout from the government, the Green New Deal. Well, now we have the oil, gas, and coal industry in there with their handout, saying we need government subsidies for our industries. So this gives us the opportunity to make our case more strongly than we ever had before. And in a way, it's going to be very difficult for them to be able to say, oh, we're going to take care of these industries that are near bankruptcy, but we're not going to help the growth industries that we're creating the bulk of the new jobs in the energy sector. So again, it's just going to come back to our ability to be up and energized and making our case.
Well, that's a good transition to, we got a number of questions about offshore wind, which as you know, is also a big priority for the Environmental League. Offshore wind power companies are unable to even begin the federal permitting process, as you know, because of some real recalcitrance at the Department of Interior. A simple initiation of the permit process at DOI would unlock financing and allow, for example, domestic shipbuilders and power cable manufacturers to begin to put people back to work on some critical elements of the supply chain. You know, ELM certainly believes that whether permits are ultimately granted needs to depend on a thorough review of environmental impacts, but starting the process is a key first step to get private capital flowing. You know, what can Congress do to ensure that when it's safe to reopen the economy, offshore wind can get going again?
Well, that's a big case that we have to make. I think, honestly, one of the preconditions is getting rid of Donald Trump as president, getting a new Secretary of the Interior, getting a new Secretary of Energy, getting a new head of the EPA. We just have to change the whole ethos in our country at the federal level. So my fear is that, to a very large extent, the fossil fuel industry sees offshore wind as as an electricity generating source that's in direct competition with natural gas for the construction of power plants in New England, but all along the East Coast. And so that political power that is exercised by the fossil fuel industry in the White House, I think is impacting the regulatory decisions which are being made. And so from my perspective, yes, I've introduced legislation to extend and expand a tax break for offshore wind with Sheldon Whitehouse, the senator from Rhode Island. We're going to fight very hard to get it included in any stimulus bill that we're talking about over the next month or 6 weeks. We're going to be making the case that it's the future, that it will create ultimately tens of thousands of jobs along the coastline, and that it's a career for younger people to be able to learn how to install this equipment, and that it can substitute for the existing generating capacity and for whatever planned new fossil fuel capacity that the utility industry or the natural gas industry was thinking about installing. That's our opportunity. And I think we have to make that case powerfully in the next few weeks so that it's clearly understood that we need the tax breaks. We need the regulatory treatment that will create these tens of thousands of jobs off our coastline and eliminate the fossil fuel, the greenhouse gases that would otherwise have been emitted into the atmosphere.
That sounds great. Question about transportation. Many listeners know that you have long been an expert on telecommunications policy. Communications and climate have been in your portfolio for a long time. Being able to telecommute these days feels like a privilege, to be able to work from home. And people are finding new ways to work from home that may last far into the future with implications for transportation emissions and congestion. How do you see telecommuting fitting into a climate-focused economic recovery?
Well, again, I agree with you, Elizabeth. I think a lot of people are learning how much of their work they could have been doing at home right from the very beginning. I think in many professions, many offices, it's actually going to change their relationship with work. And I don't think any of us believes that we're working any less hard than we were when we were in the office. I think many people are working even harder now that they're at home. But it reduces the greenhouse gases, it reduces the carbon footprint. And so I think from my perspective that we're creating a new culture in America. And the longer that people are home is the less likely that many people will want to go back to the old way in which they lived. Now, quantifying that right now is absolutely impossible, but I think it's real. And I think it's going to be expanded. I'm the author of something called the E-rate, which is a system which funds computers on the desks of children in Roxbury, in Chelsea, in Lawrence, in Malden, the poorer communities all across America, South Central LA. It's a $54 billion piece of legislation, which I was able to pass 20 years ago. Well, right now I'm trying to expand it so that we can actually have it pay not just for the computer on the desk and the access to the internet there, but also at home, because kids are going to be home. And we don't know how long this is all going to last, but we want to make sure there's no homework gap. We want to make sure that all of the capacity is there at home for those kids, especially the poorest kids, so that they don't fall further behind kids that are out in the suburbs. So I think that the more that we're forced to think about this age of coronavirus is the more that we realize that there are many smart decisions which we can make that encourage telecommuting and encourage the use of technology to avoid travel. Now, we want kids to be able to go back to the classroom, but there's a lot of people who won't want to have to necessarily go back full time to the office as well and be just as productive or more productive, and that will help us with the carbon footprint. There's going to be a temptation because the price of oil is going to be so cheap for people just to jump back into their cars and to say, I'm back out on the road again. But I think there are going to be many other people who are going to be saying, you know what, I just stay home now. And we have to create the incentives for that to happen.
So, Elam, We are a convener. We bring together voices, build coalitions, and we're proud to convene our corporate council. We have had for about 10 years businesses across the Commonwealth that join us in advocacy and that prioritize sustainability in their own operations. Many of those businesses and employees are tuning in today. What role do you think businesses can play in ensuring that recovery funds go towards a clean energy transition instead of just business as usual?
Well, I think that's going to be key. We already have, coalitions of businesses that have been created to advocate for a clean energy future as a job creation engine. We have always had difficulty with the National Chamber of Commerce, which lines up against us and works very hard to lobby against anything in any piece of legislation which would be able to help. But I think that many business leaders are going to clearly see the link between coronavirus and climate crisis, and the need for us to act in an anticipatory fashion to protect the planet, to protect their own businesses while creating massive numbers of new jobs. So I think that the coalition which we have already is something that we have to build on. I think increasingly the fossil fuel industry is going to be isolated. I think that people have been educated through coronavirus as to the need to listen to science, and we have to talk to business leaders much more intensively to build that coalition to help us in this stimulus bill too, to make sure that we have powerful voices in the business community who are speaking for us, for the perspective which we have in terms of the need to create these incentives for the clean energy technology to unfold.
All right. Well, we have so many questions streaming in from our listeners. So I'm going to turn now to the questions that are starting to come in live, Senator. And for those that are listening at home, please feel welcome to add additional questions or upvote the ones that you're particularly interested in, and we will get to as many as we possibly can. So let's talk first about carbon pricing. Can you talk about current carbon pricing legislation and the prospects for passing a meaningful carbon tax or cap and trade program?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, Elizabeth, Henry Waxman and I and Nancy Pelosi in 2009, we were able to pass the Waxman-Markey bill, which was a cap and trade system, essentially a price on carbon that would have reduced greenhouse gases by 80% by the year 2050. And it passed on the floor of the United States House of Representatives by a vote of 219 to 212. It passed. It was a cap and trade system, but that is a price on carbon. So from my perspective, we have to find a way of building a coalition to be able to accomplish that. It can be a carbon fee, it can be a cap and trade system, it can be another system by which we are giving massive incentives for development of and deployment of clean energy technologies. We have to look at it all. Everything should be on the table. Everything should be on the table. That's really what the Green New Deal says quite clearly, that we are open to whatever can work and also be done in a way that doesn't harm the poorest families, because obviously the higher the fee goes on fossil fuels to create a disincentive, is the higher the price the poorer families and blue collar families have to pay, because they don't have a discretion. They have to get to work. They have to pay for that gasoline bill. So we have to make sure that whatever we do is done so not just, from looking at it from a climate perspective, but also from a justice perspective.
One of the best programs in FDR's original New Deal was the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Yeah.
What about a citizens installation corps or a solar installation corps, a heat pump installation corps, instant opportunities for those without higher ed degrees to participate in decarbonization on the back end of COVID-19? How are you thinking about employment opportunities like that?
I love what that whole idea. The Civilian Conservation Corps was always my favorite part of the New Deal. When I was reading about what happened after FDR got elected, and that basically went to young people being taken out, planting trees, doing conservation work, And we're at an FDR moment, by the way. We're at an FDR moment where we're going to have to be thinking very seriously about universal child care. We're going to have to be thinking about universal sick leave. We're going to have to be thinking about a guaranteed income for everyone in our society. All of the things that we can now see quite clearly need to be done to protect what are called essential workers. Those are the people who can't Skype into work. They have to go and drive the bus. They have to go and work as a clerk in a grocery store. They have to be the sanitation workers. We have to provide kind of a whole new program, in my opinion, for those essential workers that is FDR-like in reflecting kind of the opportunities of today for us politically to protect those who need help. I think this idea is a quite brilliant one, that we can create a whole cadre, almost an AmeriCorps, a civilian conservation corps, to go out and do a lot of this work, to expand dramatically the people who are in AmeriCorps, to maybe raise it from 75,000 up to 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 younger people who are given a skill set to go out and to do this work in the energy sector, in the conservation sector, which will give them jobs, and they'll be doing good things in the same way that the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps did in the 1930s. So I love the idea, and I think we need the same thing for contact tracing for coronavirus across the country, a new core of young people, but the equivalent is also apt when we're talking about the energy sector, the conservation sector as well.
Terrific. We've got clearly concerns from those on the line about rollbacks. We're starting to see environmental rollbacks in the name of health and public safety on movements that have been hard fought, like plastic reduction and recycling. These are framed as temporary, but what should we do collectively to ensure we can keep momentum going forward?
Well, I think this is our moment. That's what we're celebrating today. We're celebrating Earth Day. When they celebrated Earth Day back in 1970, there was no Environmental Protection Agency. There was no Superfund program. There was no real environmental infrastructure inside of the federal government. It all had to get invented by that generation of people, young and old, who came together and said, we're now on the march. And the political leaders responded to all of that energy, which was created at that time. So this is our moment. We have to stand up. We have to show that even in the era of the coronavirus, that we're going to keep climate change front and center, that we're going to ensure that we make our case, that we're going to ensure that there's going to be a political price that's paid by the Trump administration for rolling back the fuel economy standards of the vehicles which we drive. And by the way, that's my 2007 law, which I authored, which President Obama used to increase the fuel economy standards to 54.5 miles per gallon. Well, Trump is eviscerating that law, which is going to lead to 2, 3, 4 million more barrels of oil a day being consumed that otherwise would not have had to have been consumed. He's rolling back all of these regulations right now. And so we have to put that on the ballot this November. We have to be putting the environment on the ballot. We have to put climate on the ballot. We have to make people accountable all across this country and make them stand up and defend what Trump did or abandon him for their own electoral salvation. But we have to do it. This is our moment politically where Trump has absolutely allowed the worst instincts of the polluters to have full reign inside of every one of his cabinet agencies. And if we do it, then in January of next year, we will have a chance to make the same kind of dramatic changes that Roosevelt had in 1933 or that Obama had in 2009. And when we did that huge stimulus bill, when Ed Markey passed the House, but it was killed by McConnell in the Senate, but we passed the Affordable Care Act as well in 2009. We're coming up to a big moment in 2021, and we just have to be up and activated and organized right now. Organized, not agonizing, okay? We just can't. We got to put the agonizing part of it on the side and work as hard as we can. And we will then get a disproportionate political reward than we would have if we just stand on the sidelines.
Organize, don't agonize. I like that. A follow-on question about rollbacks. The ELM team was certainly troubled to see the Trump EPA suspend enforcement of environmental laws indefinitely a couple weeks ago. And it puts an additional burden on our state environmental agencies like the Department of Environmental Protection at precisely the moment when state budgets are going to be in free fall. I mean, you're seeing estimates of a 20% reduction in state coffers next year. If you were back in the Massachusetts State House, how would you be thinking about protecting state environmental protections during this time of what may be really dire budget cuts?
Well, again, I would see it as an opportunity. I would say this is a chance to get ahead of the curve, to make the investments now in those job creation opportunities of the future. I know that a lot of leaders up in the State House, in the House and Senate, are looking at legislation right now to be able to try to attempt to move that this year. And that's what I would say happens every time. It's that those who have the most momentum, the most energy, the greatest vision, they have a chance of making big changes in eras just like this. And so that would be my opportunity that I would say should be taken advantage of by the state legislature, that they should see it as the moment where Massachusetts is number one, looking over its shoulder at number 2 and 3 in the country. That we, in every single environmental area, say, no, this is our moment. This is our moment to actually invest in and then market the fact that we are the lead environmental state. And in a way, it will create jobs on the one hand, but also make it a much more attractive place for us to live in the future, because that is the kind of place that most people want to have for their kids to be growing up. So I would just say that rather than retreating, if there's going to be a big investment in job creation, that you look at these energy sectors that we know create massive numbers of jobs in very brief periods of time.
Great. Well, we would certainly love for Massachusetts to do for clean tech what we've done for biotech, to be the best place in the nation to start with that and grow a firm that solves those kinds of problems. Senator, a lot of people are clearly troubled by the parallels in terms of racial equity and racial disparities, with COVID-19 being kind of an eerie foreshadowing of what we can expect in terms of disparities from climate. A listener writes, climate change will continue to affect the poor and vulnerable more than the rich and comfortable. How has your upbringing in Malden contributed to your point of view on the Green New Deal and climate? And how will the next stimulus package that focuses on infrastructure and energy address issues of race and equity?
That is an excellent question. Yeah, I'm here in Malden right now in the house that I grew up in. My father drove a truck for the Hood Milk Company, and I had a commute to college and to law school out of this house with my 2 brothers. All 3 of us were born in 1 year, me and then the twin boys. So we were born in 12 months, the 3 of us. So there wasn't a lot of extra spare cash coming out of the milkman's pockets. So we had a commute to college and law school from this house every day. But when I was a boy, thank you for this question. When I was a boy, the Malden River is 4 blocks down the street from here. And when I was a kid, the Malden River it was kind of black with a purple haze over it. My mother would say, even before Jimi Hendrix would talk about a purple haze over the Malden River, and tell me and my brothers, whatever you do, don't go swimming in the Malden River. It just is not safe. And so we were a blue collar community. The gas tanks were downtown. The companies we use in the Malden River really as a dumping place, the chemical companies, the rubber companies. And over the years, I'm sure it was a beautiful blue river and, 100 years before. But when I was growing up, it was black and purple. So that's where I really, for the first time, experienced, what happens if you live in a blue collar or a purple or a poorer community. That's where the pollution goes. And And that's why I believe it's so important for us to continue to focus on this. That's why Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and I, in the Green New Deal, built in that whole section on environmental justice, on frontline communities, on intersectionality, to make sure that we don't see a repetition of history in terms of where pollution is cited in our society, that we have to have a sense of justice. And so from my perspective, what's happening with coronavirus is lifting up the rock, and we can see what happens in Chelsea. 80% of their workers are like considered essential workers. You know, they've got to show up for work every single day, even as many other people are told you stay home. Well, those people are told to go out to work. And so my hope is that we'll be able to use their sacrifice for all of us. They're leaving their homes and their families every day and then coming home having been exposed to the coronavirus, as an example of the obligation we have to them, not just in terms of access to healthcare benefits and childcare and sick leave in the future, but also a cleaner environment. Because we know one of the pre-existing conditions, obviously, for the coronavirus is a weakened lung or heart system, and that's asthma. I mean, it's all related to, you know, the air which we breathe. So my hope is that we can take this as a teaching moment in terms of how the poorer communities, the communities of color, immigrant communities are much more negatively affected by disease on the one hand, but also by climate change. And it's not just here in America, but it's all across the planet. It will be the poorest communities that suffer the most. It'll be those communities that lead to the hundreds of thousands or millions of climate refugees who will be forced as each decade goes by to find a new home because of the impact, and they will be the poorest. And we have to use this as a teaching moment, say we have an opportunity to avoid this. We just can't pretend it's over there, because ultimately it comes back to us here. We just did that with coronavirus. We ignored the warning over there. We can't do the same thing for climate change.
Well, the connections between air quality and COVID are a good segue to this next question. We have received several questions on the topic of transportation. It's the largest source of emissions here in the Commonwealth and across the Northeast, and it's a significant source of the particulate air pollution that is, you know, that's leading to increased hospitalizations for particularly low-income communities. The pandemic and subsequent quarantine has shown us how quickly air pollution levels can come down as a result of reduction in car transportation. I mean, you've probably seen those before and after pictures of New Delhi and in other big urban areas. How might a stimulus affect electric vehicles? And what are your thoughts about how we incentivize or make people comfortable with public transportation, given the concerns very reasonably that people might have about being in close proximity to other people?
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think in this stimulus bill, we have to demand a long extension of the electric vehicle tax break. We were not able to do that in this last tax bill last year. We can't walk away without it. But we need the same thing to happen for the wind tax break, for the solar tax break, for the storage, battery technology tax breaks. We have to basically get in there and fight. We know what the oil and gas companies are going to be doing, trying to use the tax code to prop them up. We have to have a strategy, and we have to say that we cannot leave this without those tax incentives on the books. So in terms of all electric vehicles, we have to have a long extension of the all electric vehicle tax break. We have to create a predictable investment environment so that all of those automotive companies that had made promises about how many all electric vehicles that they were going to be producing still do it, because they can see what the tax incentives are going to be in the United States for the production of and purchase of those vehicles. So we've come a long way since 2008, 2,000 vehicles up to 1.4 million on the roads. And that's just a preview of coming attractions because of the reduction in the cost and the improvement in the technology. But we need those companies to know that there is a tax structure in our country which will incentivize them.
Great. I think we've probably got time for two more questions. So first, what hope do you have that there can be bipartisan cooperation on climate forward recovery solutions?
My hope is related to the defeat of Donald Trump and that Mitch McConnell is no longer majority leader. And we have a chance to do that over the next 6 months, and we should do it. I think that what we just saw in the elections in Wisconsin was a good example of the energy which is building on our side to vote and to remove the right-wing influence which Trump had been endorsing in that Wisconsin election. So I think there's something happening out here that's big that we can capture. And if we do it, I think all of these changes are possible. I mean, really possible. And the more that we get rid of Trump and McConnell as an influence is the more that it's going to free up moderate Republicans to do the right thing. That they won't have this onerous pressure on them that they feel right now to not cross over the aisle, even though they know what the right thing to do is. So we get a chance a little bit here to, help moderate Republicans to free them of the oppressive hand of the fossil fuel industry, which right now controls the agenda in the White House and in the Senate. And if we do that, we can make big changes on a bipartisan basis with Republicans who will realize that it's in their electoral interest to join us. It's not the opposite where they're afraid of Donald Trump. It's that they realize that their own survival is going to be tied to how well they then perform in 2022 and showing that they understood the message of the 2020 election.
And Senator, what hope do you have that there can be bipartisan cooperation on climate forward recovery solutions?
My hope is related to the defeat of Donald Trump and that Mitch McConnell is no longer majority leader. And we have a chance to do that over the next 6 months, and we should do it. I think that what we just saw in the elections in Wisconsin was a good example of the energy which is building on our side to vote and to remove the right-wing influence which Trump had been endorsing in that Wisconsin election. So I think there's something happening out here that's big that we can capture. And if we do it, I think all of these changes are possible. I mean, really possible. And the more that we get rid of Trump and McConnell as an influence is the more that it's going to free up moderate Republicans to do the right thing. That they won't have this onerous pressure on them that they feel right now to not cross over the aisle, even though they know what the right thing to do is. So we get a chance a little bit here to, help moderate Republicans to free them of the oppressive hand of the fossil fuel industry, which right now controls the agenda in the White House and in the Senate. And if we do that, we can make big changes on a bipartisan basis with Republicans who will realize that it's in their electoral interest to join us. It's not the opposite where they're afraid of Donald Trump. It's that they realize that their own survival is going to be tied to how well they then perform in 2022 and showing that they understood the message of the 2020 election.
And Senator, in 2008 and 9, a lot of the stimulus focused on climate change was focused on climate mitigation, clean energy. This is a question about climate resilience and adaptation. Preparing our country for what may be some inevitable changes ahead from climate. Could you discuss the opportunity, if any, to include climate adaptation and resilience in a COVID stimulus package? It would be a fairly significant shift from 2008 and 9.
Yeah, if the COVID recovery package moves to a big infrastructure bill, then our requirement is to make sure that every dollar inside of that stimulus bill, inside of the infrastructure portion of that stimulus bill, is a green dollar. That we're not going to go back to the old way of constructing in our country, that we're going to make sure that the new construction, the new infrastructure is green. And that's our challenge, but it's our opportunity. And if we do that, then we can influence every single part of that infrastructure bill in a way that ensures that greenhouse gases are being factored into whatever that construction project may be anywhere across the country. So we have to be on guard here, and we just have to set a standard as environmentalists that we want this to be a green infrastructure bill, that we want it to be something that is different from anything else that we've ever done in the past. And we have to make the case that that's where the most jobs are going to be created. You know, that's where the greatest long-term economic benefit is going to come from. And we've already seen it since 2009 in the wind and solar and all electric vehicle and other energy sectors where we put in the incentives. They've created those jobs, and the jobs that people want. We have to do the same thing in this infrastructure bill. And that's what I would call upon everybody who is watching this to do, is just to raise your voices, get politically active. The whole world is online. There's no more sophisticated online community than the ELM community here in Massachusetts. We are at the top of the line. This is our time. This is our place. We have to move and move aggressively in order to make sure that this infrastructure package reflects our highest values and aspirations for our country and our planet. It is the national security, environmental, economic, and moral issue of our time. We have to make sure that our voices are heard and that the legislation reflects the highest aspirations we have. We have to lift the gaze of our country to the constellation of possibilities in the energy efficiency, renewable energy sector. We can do it with your leadership. Thank you all for helping.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you. Let us all lift our gaze here on this 50th anniversary of Earth Day. I wish you could hear us clapping for you across our living rooms and offices in the Commonwealth, but we are very grateful for your time and consideration. For those listening, we have planned an exciting 10-week series of webinars on many of the issues that we touched on today, so do look out for an email from the ELM team with links to the recordings from this session. We do encourage you to share them with your network, and some information on next week's webinar, how to register for the conversation with the Pulitzer Prize-winning Boston Globe reporter, David Abel. So be well, enjoy this beautiful Earth Day, and thank you again, Senator.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you to ELM. Thank you for being the national and international leaders. Thank you.